In 1487, a single book was published in Germany. Within 2 years, it had sold more copies than any book except the Bible. By 1520, it had gone through 28 editions. It was translated into multiple languages. It was read by priests, judges, scholars, and common people across Europe. And by the time its influence finally waned, approximately 60,000 people, mostly women, had been tortured, drowned, hanged, and burned alive. The book wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even particularly well written. It was 500 pages of rambling theological arguments, contradictory logic, and paranoid fantasies about women having sex with demons. But it became the most deadly book ever printed. Not because of what it said, but because of what it gave people permission to do. Welcome to Ash and Crown History, where we explore the brutal truths that textbooks ignore. Today, we're examining the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, and you need to understand something right now. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't some primitive tribe performing rituals. This was Europe, Christian Europe, educated, civilized, legally sophisticated Europe. And they used a best-selling book to justify mass murder. Hit subscribe right now because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see books, authority, and the terrifying ease with which normal people can be convinced to commit atrocities. The Malleus Maleficarum gave ordinary people a handbook for identifying, prosecuting, and executing their neighbors. And they followed it, enthusiastically. Let me tell you about Anna Göldi. She's the last person officially executed for witchcraft in Europe, killed in Switzerland in 1782, yes, 1782, the same era as the American Revolution and the height of the Enlightenment. Anna was a domestic servant. She worked for a wealthy doctor named Johann Göldi. His 8-year-old daughter started having seizures, what we'd now recognize as epilepsy or perhaps a psychiatric disorder. Dr. Göldi, remember, he's a medical doctor, a man of science, concluded that Anna must be a witch who'd cursed his daughter. Why? Because he found pins in the girl's milk. Pins that his wife had almost certainly planted there. You see, Anna was young and attractive. Dr. Göldi's wife suspected her husband was having an affair with the servant. So she created evidence of witchcraft. Her husband, whether he believed it or was complicit in getting rid of an inconvenient situation, went along with it. Anna was arrested. She was tortured. She confessed. Of course she confessed. Everyone confesses under torture. She was beheaded in June 1782. 295 years after the Malleus Maleficarum was first published, people were still using its logic to execute women they found inconvenient. And here's what should terrify you. Anna Göldi's execution wasn't called a witch trial. By 1782, executing people for witchcraft was seen as barbaric and backwards. So they charged her with poisoning instead, changed the crime, kept the execution. The Malleus Maleficarum didn't just kill 60,000 people. It created a template for how to legally murder anyone you want by just changing what you call the crime. If you're starting to see how this pattern repeats throughout history, how authorities create legal frameworks to justify violence, then you're beginning to understand why this story matters. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History if you want to explore more of these uncomfortable historical truths. Now let me tell you about the man who wrote this death manual. Because Heinrich Kramer wasn't some medieval peasant. He was educated, respected, a man of the cloth. And he wrote the Malleus Maleficarum for the most pathetic reason imaginable: revenge. In 1485, 2 years before the book was published, Kramer was sent to Innsbruck, Austria, to investigate witchcraft accusations. He was a professional inquisitor. His entire job was finding and prosecuting heretics and witches. But when he got to Innsbruck, something unexpected happened. The local bishop, George Göldi, actually investigated Kramer's methods. And what he found disgusted him. Kramer was obsessed with women's sexuality. His interrogations were less about finding witches and more about extracting detailed descriptions of sexual acts. He asked accused women explicit questions about their bodies, their sexual experiences, their dreams. Bishop Göldi recognized this for what it was: a sexual predator using religious authority to harass women. He wrote a letter calling Kramer senile and crazy, and kicked him out of the diocese. Kramer was humiliated, rejected, his authority questioned, his methods criticized. So he went home and wrote a book proving he was right. The Malleus Maleficarum is essentially a 500-page temper tantrum from a man who was called out for his disturbing behavior. But it's a temper tantrum with a thesis. Women are inherently evil, inherently susceptible to demonic influence, and inherently dangerous to men and society. Let me read you an actual quote from the book. "What else is woman but a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature, painted with fair colors?" This is on page 44. Kramer is just warming up. He goes on to explain that women are more likely to be witches because they're more credulous, more impressionable, and, I'm quoting here, have slippery tongues. The book literally argues that women become witches because they enjoy sex too much, or because they don't enjoy sex enough, or because they had sex and regretted it, or because they wanted sex and couldn't get it. In other words, any woman, for any reason related to sexuality, could be a witch. Kramer had created a system where being female was essentially proof of guilt. But here's what made the Malleus Maleficarum so dangerous. It wasn't just misogynistic ranting. It was structured like a legal manual. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 proves that witches exist, using terrible logic and selective Bible quotes. Part 2 describes what witches do, flying, shape-shifting, having sex with demons, causing impotence in men. Kramer was really fixated on that last one. Part 3, and this is the important part, provides step-by-step instructions for legal prosecution. How to identify a witch. How to interrogate her. What questions to ask. When torture is justified. How much torture is appropriate. What counts as a confession. How to carry out the execution. Kramer created a legal framework. And legal frameworks are powerful because they make atrocities seem legitimate. You're not murdering your neighbor. You're following proper legal procedure. You're not torturing an innocent woman. You're extracting a confession as the law allows. You're not burning someone alive, you're carrying out a court-ordered execution. The Malleus Maleficarum let people commit horrific violence while feeling righteous about it. And it spread like wildfire. Let me tell you what actually happened when someone was accused of witchcraft using the Malleus Maleficarum's methods. First, accusation. This could come from anyone for any reason. Your neighbor's cow died. Your child got sick. Your beer went sour. Your husband became impotent. Literally anything bad that happened could be blamed on a witch. And once you were accused, you were already guilty. Here's why. The Malleus Maleficarum explains that witches can make themselves appear innocent. They can cry on command. They can fake piety. They can even perform good deeds to hide their evil nature. So if you acted guilty, proof you're a witch. If you acted innocent, also proof you're a witch, because only a witch would be clever enough to hide her guilt. See the problem? There's no defense. No way to prove innocence. The system is designed to convict. Next comes the interrogation. The Malleus Maleficarum recommends starting gently. Just ask the accused woman to confess. If she refuses, explain the penalties. Show her the torture devices. Let her see what's coming. Many women confessed at this stage because they'd seen what happened to women who didn't confess. They'd watched their neighbors tortured. They'd heard the screams. They knew that confession might lead to death, but refusal definitely led to torture followed by death. But if a woman still refused to confess, the Malleus Maleficarum provided detailed instructions for rigorous examination, torture. Start with the strappado, suspension by the wrists, shoulders dislocating. If that doesn't work, add weights to her feet. Still nothing? Move to the rack. Then thumbscrews. Then the boots, metal contraptions that crushed legs and feet. And here's the truly sick part. The Malleus Maleficarum warns that witches might be able to use magic to resist pain. So if a woman endures torture without confessing, that's not evidence of innocence. That's evidence she's using witchcraft to resist. The system was designed so that literally nothing could prove innocence. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you didn't confess, torture would be increased until you did confess. If you somehow managed to endure torture without confessing, that proved you were using magic, which proved you were a witch. There was no escape. Let me tell you about Katharina Kepler. You might recognize the last name. She was the mother of Johannes Kepler, the famous astronomer who figured out how planets orbit the sun. In 1615, when Johannes was already a renowned scientist, his 70-year-old mother was accused of witchcraft by a neighbor in Germany. The accusation? A woman drank a potion Katharina had given her and got sick. The potion was probably just an herbal remedy. Katharina was known as a local healer. But the neighbor claimed it was a curse. Johannes Kepler, one of the most brilliant minds in Europe, a man who'd literally changed our understanding of the cosmos, spent the next 6 years fighting to save his mother's life. He used every connection he had. He wrote legal briefs. He hired lawyers. He appealed to nobles and church officials. He used his fame as a scientist to argue that the accusations were baseless. And you know what? It barely worked. Katharina Kepler was imprisoned for 14 months. She was shown the torture devices. She was threatened with the strappado. At 70 years old, frail and terrified, she was repeatedly told that if she didn't confess, she would be tortured until she did. She refused to confess, even facing torture. Even at 70, even after 14 months in prison. She insisted she was innocent. The judges didn't know what to do. The Malleus Maleficarum said refusal to confess after being shown torture devices was evidence of witchcraft. But Johannes Kepler's intervention, his fame, his connections, his relentless legal maneuvering created just enough doubt. They released her in 1621. She died 6 months later, broken by the ordeal. Think about that. It took one of the most famous scientists in Europe, using all his influence and resources, 6 years of constant effort to save his elderly mother from being tortured and executed for witchcraft. If your mother had been accused, what chance would she have had? The Malleus Maleficarum created a system so powerful, so entrenched, that even famous scientists couldn't easily fight it. And here's what's truly disturbing. The witch hunts weren't limited to ignorant peasants. Educated people, judges, scholars, clergy, fully supported the prosecutions. They'd read the Malleus Maleficarum. They believed its arguments. They followed its procedures. Intelligence doesn't protect you from believing terrible things. Education doesn't prevent you from participating in atrocities. The Malleus Maleficarum proved that you can convince intelligent, educated people to torture and execute their neighbors by giving them a book that makes it seem legal and necessary. If you're disturbed by how easily educated people can be convinced to commit atrocities, then you need to understand the full scope of this history. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History. We explore the patterns that repeat across centuries, showing how the same psychological mechanisms are used again and again. Now let's talk about who actually got accused. Because the Malleus Maleficarum created a profile of the typical witch, and that profile reveals what the witch hunts were really about. According to trial records from across Europe, the typical witch was female, about 80 of accusations, poor or lower middle class, over 50 years old, widowed or unmarried, outspoken or quarrelsome, practiced folk medicine or herbal healing. See the pattern. The typical witch was a woman without male protection who didn't conform to social expectations. Old women who owned property were accused, and once convicted, their property was confiscated. Widows who refused to remarry were accused. Healers who competed with male doctors were accused. Women who argued with their neighbors were accused. Women who were just weird or unlikable were accused. The Malleus Maleficarum gave communities a legal method to eliminate women they found inconvenient. Let me give you a specific example. In the German town of Würzburg between 1626 and 1631, just 5 years, 900 people were executed for witchcraft. 900! In a town of about 40,000 people. That's more than 2 of the entire population. Executed. In 5 years. And who benefited? The church authorities who seized the property of the executed. The local prince-bishop who consolidated power by eliminating potential opponents. The male relatives who inherited from executed women. The witch hunts were profitable. They concentrated wealth and power in male hands. They eliminated women who owned property, practiced medicine, or challenged authority. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't really about fighting evil. It was about social control and wealth redistribution disguised as religious duty. But here's where the story gets even darker. The Catholic Church tried to stop it. I know that sounds contradictory. Wasn't the Church behind the witch hunts? Actually, no. Not initially. In 1487, when Kramer first tried to get church approval for his book, he was rejected. Church officials thought his ideas were extreme. Some called him crazy. Remember, the Bishop of Innsbruck had already called him senile. So Kramer did something incredibly dishonest. He forged a letter of approval from Pope Innocent VIII and included it in the front of his book. The Pope had issued a general bull, official letter, in 1484 acknowledging that witchcraft was a problem and giving inquisitors authority to investigate. It was a fairly standard, vague document. Kramer took this existing bull, added it to his book, and made it seem like the Pope had specifically endorsed the Malleus Maleficarum. He hadn't. The Church officially condemned the book in 1490, just 3 years after publication. But it was too late. The book was already a bestseller. And once something is published, once it's out there being read and discussed and followed, you can't just recall it. The Malleus Maleficarum spread despite church disapproval. Why? Because it gave local authorities what they wanted. A legal justification for eliminating problematic women and seizing their property. This is what makes the Malleus Maleficarum so dangerous as a case study. It wasn't imposed from the top down by church leadership. It was adopted from the bottom up by local officials who found it useful. Nobody forced judges to follow its procedures. Nobody mandated that courts accept its logic. People chose to use it because it gave them permission to do what they already wanted to do. And that's the real lesson of the Malleus Maleficarum. Given the right justification, ordinary people will commit extraordinary evil. All they need is a framework that makes it seem legitimate, legal, and necessary. Now let me tell you how the witch hunts finally ended. Because it's not the story you think. The witch hunts didn't end because people became more compassionate. They didn't end because someone proved witches didn't exist. They didn't end because of religious reform or scientific advancement. The witch hunts ended because they became economically unsustainable and socially destabilizing. By the late 1600s, witch hunts were getting out of control. In some regions, so many people had been executed that entire villages were depopulated. Local economies collapsed. Tax revenues plummeted. And the accusations weren't staying confined to poor old women anymore. Wealthy people were being accused. Nobles, priests, even judges who'd participated in witch trials were accused of witchcraft. When the daughter of a French magistrate was accused, he suddenly discovered that maybe the evidence standards were too low. When the wife of a wealthy merchant was accused, he suddenly thought the procedures might be unjust. The system started eating itself. And once wealthy, powerful men felt threatened, reform became possible. But it wasn't immediate. It was gradual. Different regions stopped at different times. The last mass witch trial in Germany was in 1749. More than 250 years after the Malleus Maleficarum was published. Anna Göldi, remember, wasn't killed until 1782. The Malleus Maleficarum's influence lasted for 3 centuries. 300 years of torture, execution, and terror based on a book written by a bitter inquisitor angry that someone called him crazy. Let that sink in. One man's revenge fantasy killed tens of thousands of people over 3 centuries. Now here's where this connects to today. And I want you to really think about this because it's uncomfortable. The Malleus Maleficarum worked because it tapped into existing fears and prejudices. It didn't create misogyny, it provided a framework for expressing it. It didn't invent the idea that women were dangerous. It made that idea seem logical and legally actionable. In other words, the Malleus Maleficarum succeeded because people were already primed to believe its message. It just gave them permission to act on beliefs they already held. And this pattern repeats throughout history. Books, pamphlets, speeches, social media posts, they don't create hatred out of nothing. They take existing prejudices, fears, and resentments and provide a framework that makes acting on them seem justified. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic hoax, didn't create anti-Semitism, but it gave anti-Semites a source to cite. Mein Kampf didn't create German nationalism, but it provided a framework for expressing it through violence. Today, conspiracy theories spread on social media don't create fear of others, but they provide a narrative that justifies that fear. The Malleus Maleficarum teaches us that the most dangerous books aren't the ones that introduce new evil ideas. They're the ones that make existing evil ideas seem reasonable. And here's what should terrify you: we're better at this now. The Malleus Maleficarum took years to spread across Europe. Modern disinformation spreads globally in hours. The Malleus Maleficarum reached educated clergy who could read Latin. Modern propaganda reaches everyone with a smartphone. The Malleus Maleficarum required printing presses and distribution networks. Modern content requires one click. We have all the same psychological vulnerabilities that made the Malleus Maleficarum effective: fear of the other, desire for simple explanations, need to blame someone for our problems, but now those vulnerabilities can be exploited at scale, instantly, and globally. So here's my final question for you. What's our Malleus Maleficarum? What book, what idea, what narrative are we following right now that future generations will look back on with horror? What are we doing that seems legal, justified, and necessary, but is actually just a framework for expressing our prejudices? Because here's the thing about the Malleus Maleficarum. Everyone involved thought they were doing the right thing. The judges thought they were protecting their communities. The accusers thought they were stopping evil. The executioners thought they were carrying out justice. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. 60,000 people dead wrong. But they didn't know they were wrong. They had a book that told them they were right. They had legal procedures. They had confessions. They had evidence. And they killed innocent people while feeling righteous about it. So what are we righteous about? What are we so certain of that we're willing to hurt people to maintain that certainty? What's our swimming test? What's our Malleus Maleficarum? If this video made you think differently about books, authority, and the frameworks we use to justify our actions, then you need to subscribe to Ash and Crown History. We explore the patterns of history that keep repeating, not to make you cynical but to make you aware. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me, what modern ideology or practice do you think future generations will condemn the way we condemn witch hunts? Share this video with someone who believes that educated, civilized societies can't commit atrocities. Let's have a conversation about how easily normal people can be convinced to do terrible things when given the right framework. Thanks for watching Ash and Crown History. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore more uncomfortable truths about how systems of oppression protect themselves by calling themselves systems of justice. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1487. The last person it killed died in 1782. That's 295 years of death from one book. How long will it take us to recognize our modern equivalents? Stay curious, stay questioning, and never forget, the most dangerous books are the ones that make evil seem rational.